Hi everyone, as promised, I'm back again with a fun football functions video. My greatest criticism of certain sports analytics is the barrier for entry that it takes to understand them. I ranted on a previous Ashwarmers podcast with my brother about how basketball's player efficiency rating is needlessly obtuse. I've also thought the same of the quarterback rating systems football uses. The rating scale doesn't have a context that can be explained without raising more questions. How do these stats relate to other aspects of the game? Is something overrated? Have the equations been updated to reflect changes in rules or general style? It's why I have much more faith in baseball analytics. They've been refined over the last 40 years to gain acceptance for their relative accuracy and greater understanding of relative player contributions to team success. While wins above replacement needs an explanation as to how it's generated, putting it into a relatable context allows me to understand how valuable one player is when compared to another. Taking one look at how points relate to ESPN's total quarterback rating makes me wonder just why they didn't think to go the extra 100 feet and put it into a wins index instead of a 0 to 100 rating. That creates my greatest complaint about the rating system. It's not translatable to other positions, and it places quarterbacks on a pedestal. Football is a team sport more than any other, and to hold one position as intrinsically more valuable discounts the contributions of all other players. And though it is clumsy to assume that apples can always be compared to oranges, it's convenient to put things in a relative context to understand their value. I originally meant to create a value for all other positions and subtract the combined values to find a relative range the quarterback value would be. But after thinking about the intrinsic value of the position, it might be better to start with quarterbacks and double back to correct my inaccuracies with a better understanding of other positional groups. I do enjoy viewing baseball's WAR ratings, so I wanted to know just how many wins a single player would account for based on a yards to points ratio. But first, I need to know just how many points each yard gained is actually worth. I looked at cumulative stats instead of how many yards gained of each type contributed to an offensive point at the micro level. It just made it easier. I took each team's touchdowns from rushing and passing, multiplied each by 7 to get a base amount of points contributed for each team from each style, and then I needed to separate the number of points scored through returns of both special teams and defense to have an estimate of all non-touchdown points. I did forget to remove safeties from the equation, but because of their rarity, I felt they wouldn't be a factor. I then took the ratio of pass and run plays from total plays to get an understanding of how the remainder points would divide themselves. I added the adjusted amounts to the initial base amounts for each style for an estimated amount of points for each. After which, I divided the points via style by the yards gained for a ratio of what each yard is worth in terms of points. I've never liked that every measure of passer efficiency always seems to add statistics that have little to do with quarterback performance. One such statistic is total yards passing for a player because a certain percentage of that yardage is gained after the catch. This is a receiver-specific stat. I simply took the percentage of yards gained before the catch, which for each team could be applied to individual passing numbers as a responsible yards gained statistic. What I also needed was a better understanding of what average field position a team started in. This way, discounting a team with a better defense receiving a more favorable scoring chance. I took the league average for yard distance from the goal line, which in this case was 71.8 yards. I then took every team's distance and divided it by the league average to have a modifier for yards gained in respect to defensive chances. Last, I needed to know what each drive was worth to a team's scoring for an estimate of points lost per drive ended prematurely. I just needed the adjusted offensive scoring numbers divided by the offensive drives. And voila! Now that I had the numbers for each team, I could dive into how much each quarterback's stats would line up with my preliminary ratios. I took the top 30 quarterbacks in terms of passing yards. I would have taken more, but E.J. Manuel and Josh McCown both had less than 2,000 yards passing, and several members of the list had fewer than 12 games played, which seemed to level out my sample size. I capped the attempts per game at 37 to keep quarterbacks in pass-happy offenses from having an unfair advantage. I multiplied the cap by games played and subtracted the result from total pass attempts. For most, the cap was 592 attempts. Anyone over the cap had their yards per attempt over subtracted from their total yards. Only Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Joe Flacco, Drew Brees, Matt Ryan, and Matthew Stafford were over the cap. I took the adjusted passing yards for each player and multiplied them by the modifier for yards after catch per team. This one was the equalizer, as most of the league had greater than half their yardage gained by receiver action. I then multiplied the remainder by the team points per yards ratio for the points contributed through passing yardage. I originally thought that rushing yards might overvalue some of the more mobile quarterbacks, but almost no team had a ratio greater than 1/4 of the passing ratio. After multiplying rush yards by the points modifier, I added the points contributed through passing together so that we had an unadjusted point total. To understand points lost, I added interceptions to fumbles for a number of total turnovers committed by each quarterback. This was multiplied by the average number of points per drive for an amount of points lost for a drive ending instantly. It was then subtracted from the unadjusted points number for a net points responsible amount. By multiplying it with the modifier for starting field position, it gives a normalized point amount. Using this number, we can run the points responsible amount through the Pythagorean win theorem to estimate how many wins the player is responsible for. To keep it as fair as possible, I used the league average for points allowed, which was 373.6. In this case, everyone's win share was rated based on their team achieving 8 wins, so the aggregate wins responsible number needs to be divided by 8 to find each quarterback's win share. It turns out that any way you slice it, Peyton Manning was far and away the best quarterback in the league in 2013. The closest quarterback was Phillip Rivers, who lagged over half a win behind the MVP. Drew Brees and Tony Romo were the only others to rank over one aggregate win responsible for an 8-win team, with Russell Wilson rounding out my top 5. But the more telling stat was that Peyton only accounted for 25% of the Broncos' wins, identifying just how overrated the quarterback position can be, especially when the top 30 average for quarterback contribution is less than 7%. And this is without a modifier for offensive line play and with only the basic modifier for defensive contributions to offensive scoring. I've complained for years that the fantasy of quarterback value was out of control, and like sabrmetrics before in baseball, teams need a better way of assessing value to maximize efficiency. The NFL might be too in love with its marketing brand and the status quo that goes along with it. But pride comes before the fall, and there is much pride to fall over. You can check me out on Twitter at @SteveCasper and listen to my Ashmore's podcast on YouTube. See you next time.